Hello and welcome back. I'm Greg. So we were talking in part 4 about two different kinds of why questions. The sort of naive why question that is really more about hows and whats, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm going to take you on a brief analysis of what we can call the interpretational quality of the why questions, both of them. Why there is this contrast between them, and the more radical sense of the second why question, which we touched upon last time. All of this in light of our general question about how hermeneutics is crucial and necessary to our journey to question authority, confront the tradition, and thereby change our shared world, and to do so together. We said that the first why question was of an epistemological sort. Why do the whats and hows of my existence themselves exist? It is asked within the ambit of the how do we know what we know category. This is kind of old hat, right? And we generally refer to theory of knowledge as that kind of meta-narrative, if you will. It's a discursive meta-narrative that suggests, okay, we do know something, and yet how do we know it? Okay, on the one hand, we have David Hume saying we know this, and then Immanuel Kant saying, well, okay, we do, but how do we know that, etc. So this is a sense that we have the arc of the 18th century present to us. It's a necessary arc. It's a fascinating one. But at the same time, hermeneutics, and especially phenomenological hermeneutics, goes beyond this Enlightenment arc. We'll come to that over the course of this series of talks. So in so doing, we recognize the second why question as one of ethics. What is the purpose of my specific existence, given everything else I've understood about it thus far? Ethics claims, and from the first instance, that the very idea of purpose is held within the world, and does not emanate from any possible other world. Indeed, this latter space was held to be the source of morality, not ethics, and the chief difference between the two oft confused conceptions is one of hermeneutics. Morals presents the logos as if it were still mythos. Morals are meant to be timeless, and inchoate principles, echoing the transparency of meaning available to the gods themselves. But ethics involves us in a real-time decision-making process, which understands the world to be diverse and inchoate enough. As Gadamer famously put it, life is vague. There were analytic philosophers, of course, that sort of pointed the finger at Gadamer and said, well, your philosophy is interesting, but it's kind of vague, in terms of our standards. And then Gadamer simply replied, well, you know what? Life is vague. That is reality, after all. And I completely agree with his assessment there. So this decision-making process is worldly, if you will. It requires the acknowledgement that what might have been good in or for one context might not be in the next, and hence the same for bad. Morality is thus epistemological in terms of our two why questions. Morality is the template of how we do what we are supposed to do. Okay? Ethics, by contrast, is unsurprisingly ethical. It presents to us the purpose of doing what we actually do, or in hindsight, helps us interpret and even analyze what we have already done. Ethics does not disclose the world of a piece. Sometimes we will not know if we have made the right decision for some period of time while we wait to see how things actually turn out. This is very different from morality, obviously, because morality assumes from the start that if you heed the principle, then you will always be right, as well as in the right. Okay, the world simply doesn't work that way, and even the people who were the moralists understood that. It's not that the moralist was sitting around saying, okay, yeah, well, the world should cleave to my version of how people should act, and if it's sort of a cultural tradition or a customary code of morality, like the Decalogue, for example, the Hebrew Decalogue, there's a sense that the ancient Hebrews could not possibly have thought that, okay, the world functions exactly according to these 10 commandments, but we need these 10 commandments to sort of guide us towards a better functioning world. Okay, so even the moralists are sort of aware that, okay, the morality is a guideline. These principles are ideals, and we should sort of move in their direction. And how we move in that direction involves us in, obviously, interpretation. And that brings ethics into play in action. Ethics is not exactly morality in action, if you will, but ethics has this kind of unquiet relationship with morality ever since Aristotle and onwards. And that relationship is not something that we're going to get into here directly, but we're going to touch upon it sort of regularly in our discourse here. So what it does disclose then, what ethics, if it doesn't disclose the world as a piece, it does disclose is more akin to the way of the world in its worlding with us. This way is hermeneutic precisely because our actions require that others interpret them, and we must enjoin ourselves to theirs in kind. Even unspoken behaviors must be interpreted. That this occurs seemingly automatically in most mundane cases does not obviate its hermeneutic tenor. It is just that we are well practiced in many things, having their order in the common sociality of the day. When we are first exposed to poetry, for instance, as young people, what is first called to attention is that this habituation is something that is learned. It is a process of understanding which, as we have noted, requires comprehension first, just as when the revolutionary thinker has been moved to change because she has absorbed much of the relevant discourses already extant and thus found them in some way wanting. In a word, the first why question gives the rebel a cause. This is a major trope in much fiction. Let's just take a quick tangent. We're still working with text, obviously, and then there's a sense that, okay, this is a kind of tried and tested plot device. The heroine must first comprehend what is going on before she attempts to either change it, stop it, or throw herself under its suasion. Indeed, at first joining with her enemies might be the only way to eventually sabotage them. Hence, knowing their what becomes yet more crucial. This trope maintains its popularity simply because this is exactly how all of us must function in our youth. We must join society as full members before we begin to dismantle it, whatever be the scope of this latter action. And this is one of the great ethical errors, perhaps, of the digital generations. Okay? Not that I'm trying to point fingers at people younger than myself, but because every generation has had their out, if you will, has had their way of turning away from the world. The error is the same. Okay, perhaps in the 1960s, it was psychogenics, psychotropics, and their widespread use, tuning in and turning off. Not good enough. Okay, it's also it's not an ethical choice, nor is it one that marks you as a mature human being. Now, equally so, right? The digital generations, beginning very in a nominal way with my own, have had their way of turning away, all-encompassing in many ways, just as any addiction is. Once again, same ethical error. Okay? Instead, to repeat, we have to join society as full members before we begin to dismantle it. A studied youth, then, is the key to a successful revolution in adulthood. Note that both Lenin and Mao, amongst many others, took this road. From politics to philosophy, there is a sense that what is of the utmost demands first the comprehension of tradition before any comprehension with it can commence. Kant's silent decade, occurring while he was working on his first critique, is evidence of this patient upswing. It is therefore all the more remarkable that his catalyst, Hume, we've talked about both of them already, completed his own masterwork at the tender age of 29. This makes even Heidegger, who was 38 when Being and Time appeared, look like a seasoned veteran of thinking. By contrast, my first book was published when I was 37, and if I have written a masterwork, I'm not quite blissfully unaware of it. However such may be, it is clear that in order to make a substantial impact in one's core of the world at large, one must come to terms with one's object before coming to grips with it. Right? So the idea that one can sort of just drop out, turn away, maybe create an alternate world, or get addicted to one that's deliberately created for you, that's not an option. Okay? Not for young people and not for older people. We shall have much more to say about how worlding and interpretation get along or conflict with one another in the final section below in terms of this entire journey together. But for now, we should recognize that what de Saussure said was true for sentential meaning is also the case for comprehension in general. We can apply the same rubric. History has an x-axis. This is the going rate of how this or that event or figure is interpreted today. But these historical notables have many other possible interpretations arranged along the y-axis and intersecting with the going rate whenever we ask the appropriate questions. We bring not only doubt into play as part of the hermeneutic in hand, but as well the ability to both differentiate elements laid out along the y-axis and thence differing along that same spectrum. It's almost like you're a surgeon with a scalpel, or a laser scalpel, if you become very skilled with hermeneutics, right? We've got the going rate, we have the body as it is, and you're going to cut into it, right, at a precise point. You're going to slice it open and say, hey, this is one possibility of existence. This is one possibility of interpretation, but you know what? There's others. Let's get them all out on the table and examine them all at once. Compare them with one another. Let's see if what we've chosen really is the best option. Or perhaps it might be one of the worst. We're only going to know if we take that laser scalpel and bring that y-axis into play, to intersect with this going rate of the x-axis. So we bring doubt into play, we bring differentiation into play, and if we begin to imagine that the going rate does not tell the whole story, and does it ever tell that whole story? We have to ask that question. Then the meaning held within the x-axis becomes deferred. We have had occasion to nod to Jacques Derrida at this point, due to his remark that the combination of Saussurean characters at the very point of intersection of axes does not so much fixed meaning as might be implied, though we should remind ourselves that the 1916 course is, after all, composed of students' notes, but rather sends it spiraling off into indefinite différence. Perhaps both senses are a trifle overdone. In use, we do decide upon a meaning, even if in theory, or even if in the actual structure of language itself. The lack of fixity is the very thing that allows us the freedom and flexibility to understand meaning in the first place. Okay, this is a very hermeneutic take on it, rather than a kind of deconstructionist take. In text, the going rate is to assume that the author or writer has made such decisions for us and thus is able to present his vision in whole cloth without the nagging doubt of différence and the pesky alternate elements of the y-axis. And this presumption is appropriate to the first why question, which goes along with both epistemology on the one hand and morality on the other. Glosses relevant to text include: how does the character present herself? How is she perceived by others? Are her actions consistent with her presentation? And the like. We can attribute a more or less specific series of meanings to what we are reading. In so doing, we set ourselves up to ask the second why question of the text in itself. What is the purpose of presenting such a character at all? And how does this character disclose part of the world in which I actually live? These are much more pointed, personal, profound questions that work within the sphere of ethics and not epistemology. The process of interpreting a fictional text is at first almost as semi-conscious and habituated as is that of social interaction in the real world. And once this is salutary for realism in and of itself, the narrative at hand should invoke, at least at first, feelings of recognition and even comfort. But as there is no story to be told without conflict, these immediate emotions should soon be jostled, if not utterly overtaken, by the sensation of dis-ease. When this occurs in the traditional plot structure, we have the incipience of what has been referred to as the rising action. At the moment of greatest discomfort with our presumed meetings, the usual climax in the fictional narrative occurs. If we are a moralist at heart, we may be taken with a resolution which restores the balance that we imagined we had at the beginning of the story. But if we are an ethicist, we are hoping rather for some kind of change, however small, but always wise and to the good, which does not restore the original status quo, but rather improves upon it. Okay? So if you start thinking about your own life, especially with young people, you're at the very beginning of the rising action in a life narrative, right? You might be 12, 13, 14, and there is conflict, right? Because you've started to be able to question things around you, question the things that you're being told, question the things that you're being told to do, and even, indeed, how to think. Okay? As a philosopher, I want to encourage you to question those as often and as radically as possible, but at the same time, you have to stay with the world in order to make those questions authentic. Okay, you can't sort of shrug it off and say, "Oh, I don't want to do this. I'm just going to go play my video game for 3 hours." Okay, that simply doesn't cut it. It's not going to do you any good, nor is it going to do the world any good, which in some ways is the greater point, right? We are our human existence is beholden to that world, and it is up to us as the local sentient consciousness, insofar as we know, to make as many improvements upon that world as possible. You're not going to be able to do that, right, if you turn away from the world, no matter how interesting these other contraptions and contrived worlds may be or may become for you. Okay? Now that sounds like I'm being a moralist. So what am I really getting at here? Let's just push on just a little further. Okay? Just bear with me. Okay. So, even if we cleave to this more conservative sensibility, we recognize that the second why question must still be asked. It has the function of a moral audit in this view. Is my sense of the good life, or the good person, or even the general good really all that it is chalked up to be? The only way to find out is by throwing it on the table. It may well be, pending the kind of text we've chosen to read, that we retrieve our original bet and nothing in itself is altered other than I now know the better why, exactly, my moral viewpoint was, after all, the least viable. If we hanker after revolution, or at the very least some kind of progress, we nonetheless enact the same gambit as does the perhaps stuffy Stoic at our side. By putting it all on the table with the second why question, we are out to not merely prove him wrong, but as well wrong-headed. The first simply addresses the stuff of his thinking, but the second confronts the thinking itself. Okay? And this is the key thing. We can interrogate the world in terms of what it looks like and its content, and it's just, well, why this and why not that? But what we really want to be after, and what we need to learn to do, even as young people, is to go after that second why question and say, okay, this is how we think about all of this, but why this form of thinking at all? Okay? Are there other ways to think about it? Forget about content, right? Because at the end of the day, I can go into Walmart and say, okay, well, I didn't like this brand. I'm going to try another one. Okay? Or you're playing a video game and it kind of craps out on you. It's like, okay, I'm going to play another video game. That's not real choice in the end. Those are the kinds of questions that say, okay, I'm content with the content of the world as long as the content itself has diversity in it. Okay. Again, that's a first step, but that is not where we ultimately need to be. If we are proven correct by the climax and subsequent resolution of the narrative conflict, we make some gains at the table and are able to say, well, after all, your morality was not quite up to snuff, which is, well, one would hope, a tacit caution to ourselves, right, to not hold too closely to our own moral sensibility, given case in point. Either way, the hermeneutic process holds equally. Our Caesarean author may not have been fatally wounded by our Doridian reader, but he has certainly been brought face to face with his own risking gambit. And thus, if there is a balance in textual interpretation, it occurs between the authorial risk and that readerly. Okay, so the reader is risking something too. And this is a patently hermeneutic balance attained through a process of dialectical dialogue. As a fiction writer, which is something I came to very late in my writing career, this is in fact what I want of the reader. But as a philosophical author, I am more presuming upon the text itself to engender the necessary confrontation. That the latitude available for the interpretation of fiction is wider than that of nonfiction, let alone the latter's scholarly subset, is a necessity, outdone only by that of poetry. With fiction, the y-axis is much longer and more agile in its ability to intersect with any presumed or even concluded meaning. If différance is the very engine of poetry, even in simpler verse forms, such as the incantation or the limerick, the y-axis still has its moments. And in nonfiction, the x-axis flexes its more blinkered, if ongoing, and processual musculature. Fiction gives to us the balanced, deferred dynamic. It is thus not surprising that when people think about the very idea of interpreting text, they are usually referring to fiction, and especially to the narrative form. There is an assumption, however, that hermeneutics seeks to expose and revamp, and that is that nonfiction does not require such interpretation, and that sacred texts are somehow beyond it, or at the least sacrosanct, and thus protected from it. We're going to take apart all of those assumptions next time. Okay? These are common misunderstandings of interpretation in light of textual hermeneutics, and we will break them down in part 6. So I hope that you'll join me for that. Thanks again.